Iran just crossed a line that nobody in Washington is willing to ignore anymore. And what Trump said at 4 in the morning tells you everything you need to know about where this war is headed. We are now 2 months into an active military conflict between the United States and Iran. 2 months. And most people are still not grasping the full weight of what that means. This isn't a proxy fight. This isn't sanctions. This isn't threatening tweets. This is a real war, Operation Epic Fury. Yes, and it is still going. And as of this week, the man in the Oval Office is running out of patience in a very public and very serious way. Let's start with what happened early Wednesday morning, because this is where things get interesting. At just after 4 a.m., President Trump logged onto Truth Social and posted something that immediately set off alarm bells across the political world. He wrote, and these are his exact words, "Iran can't get their act together. They don't know how to sign a non-nuclear deal." And then came the line that really caught everyone's attention. They better get smart soon. Now, on the surface, that might sound like typical Trump frustration. Strong words, sharp tone. But here's what's really happening beneath the surface of that post. This isn't just venting. This is a signal, a very deliberate, very calculated signal sent to Tehran at 4 in the morning while most of America was asleep. And it came with an image, an AI-generated image of Trump in a dark suit and aviator sunglasses, holding an AK-47 with explosions going off in the background. Stamped across the image were 4 words, "No more Mr. Nice Guy." Let that sink in for a second. The President of the United States, 2 months into an active war with Iran, posts that image with that message before the sun even comes up. That is not an accident. That is not impulsive. That is a message being sent on purpose, and Iran and the rest of the world received it loud and clear. But to really understand why this moment matters, we need to go back and understand what this war is actually about. Because most people think they know, but most people missed the deeper layer here. Here's what's really happening. The conflict didn't start over oil. It didn't start over territorial disputes in the traditional sense. At the core of Operation Epic Fury, the military operation that the United States launched on February 28th is one single issue that the Trump administration has called non-negotiable from day one: Iran's nuclear program. That's it. That is the foundation of this entire conflict. The White House has been consistent from the beginning. They've said it over and over. Iran pursuing nuclear weapons capability is not something the United States will accept. Not under negotiation, not on a delayed timeline, not with conditions. The position has been clear. Iran must agree to give up its nuclear ambitions, and that conversation has to happen before anything else moves forward. But Iran has a completely different position, and this is where the real tension lies. Tehran has been demanding that the nuclear question be taken completely off the table during peace negotiations. Their argument is essentially this: let's agree to a ceasefire, let's reopen the Strait of Hormuz, let's stabilize the region. And then, maybe after all of that, we can talk about nuclear stuff. Maybe. You can probably already see why that is a non-starter for Washington, because think about it. If the United States agrees to stop the war, allows Iran to reopen trade through the Strait of Hormuz, and lifts pressure, and then Iran walks away from any nuclear discussion, what has actually been accomplished? Iran would emerge from this conflict with its nuclear program intact, its leverage restored, and the United States having spent enormous resources on a war that changed nothing about the fundamental threat. That's why Secretary of State Marco Rubio went on Fox News this past Monday and said something that really deserves more attention than it's getting. Rubio didn't just talk about nuclear weapons in the abstract. He laid out the full picture. He said, and pay close attention to this, the nuclear question is the reason why we're in this in the first place. But then he went further. He explained that Iran isn't just a radical country in the traditional sense. He described Iran as a revolutionary state, a government that doesn't just want to control its own territory, but actively seeks to export its ideology, its influence, and its power across the entire region. And he backed that up with specifics. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran; Hamas, Iran supported. Militias operating across Iraq, Iran-backed. This isn't speculation. This is documented. Iran has for decades been funding, training, and directing armed groups across the Middle East as part of what Rubio described as a larger revolutionary project. Now, here's where it gets even more serious. Rubio then shifted to the Strait of Hormuz. And this part of the conversation is something that the financial world the energy market, and honestly, everyday Americans should be paying very close attention to. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically important waterways on the planet. It is the narrow passage through which approximately 1/5, 20%, of the world's total oil supply passes every single year. Every year, tankers loaded with crude oil, refined petroleum, liquefied natural gas, all of it moves through that narrow stretch of water. And right now, Iran controls the ability to disrupt that passage. Rubio didn't mince words. He called the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's ability to close it off or threaten it, an economic nuclear weapon. His words, an economic nuclear weapon that Iran, as he put it, is actively bragging about using. He said Iran is putting up billboards in Tehran, actual billboards, celebrating the fact that they can hold 20 to 25% of the world's energy supply hostage. They are openly advertising this as a source of national pride and strategic leverage. Now think about what that means for the global economy, for gas prices, for supply chains, for every country in the world that depends on energy flowing through that strait. This isn't a regional problem. This is a global economic pressure point. And Iran is sitting right on top of it, fully aware of the power that gives them. And then Rubio asked the question that really frames the entire stakes of this conflict. Imagine if those same people had access to a nuclear weapon. That's the scenario the Trump administration is trying to prevent. An Iran that can already threaten 20% of the world's energy supply. Now add a nuclear weapon to that. Now they don't just hold energy markets hostage. They hold entire governments hostage. They hold the region hostage. They hold the conversation hostage. That is what Operation Epic Fury is really about. Not just this moment, not just this war, but preventing that future from ever becoming a reality. And now we're 2 months in, and the deal still isn't done, which brings us back to that 4 a.m. Truth Social post and why it carries so much weight. Because here's something most people missed about the timing of all this. Trump's post came just hours before War Secretary Pete Hegseth was scheduled to appear before the House Armed Services Committee. This was a major moment. The first time Hegseth had been called to answer questions from lawmakers since Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th. The hearing was officially about the administration's proposed military budget for 2027, and that budget proposal is itself a historic number. $1.5 trillion in defense spending. That would be the largest military budget in American history by a significant margin. But here's what everyone knew walking into that hearing room. The budget was almost secondary. The real questions, the ones lawmakers on both sides of the aisle had been waiting 2 months to ask, were about the war. About the strategy, about the timeline, about what victory actually looks like, about what happens if Iran refuses to negotiate on the nuclear issue indefinitely. And Hegseth walked in there carrying the weight of all of it. Let's break this down, because there are really 2 separate but connected conversations happening simultaneously right now. The first is the military and diplomatic conversation. What is the path to ending this conflict? What are the conditions? What does the United States actually need to walk away from this, calling it a success? That conversation is being driven by the Trump administration, and the non-negotiable at the center of it is Iran's nuclear program. The second conversation is a political and budgetary one. Is the American public and Congress prepared to sustain a $1.5 trillion defense posture? And is there political will to continue this operation if Iran continues to stall? Both of those conversations are happening at the same time, in the same week, and they are deeply connected to each other. Because here's the reality. Wars cost money. They cost political capital. They cost public attention and public patience. And the longer a conflict drags on without a clear resolution, the more pressure builds, not just on the opposing side, but domestically. The Trump administration knows this. Which is why the pressure campaign against Iran is being escalated across multiple fronts simultaneously. Early morning social media posts, cabinet secretaries going on national television to lay out the stakes, congressional hearings designed to demonstrate continued resolve, a proposed military budget that signals long-term commitment to defense readiness. This is not a coincidence. This is a coordinated message being sent. The United States is not backing down, the clock is ticking, and Iran needs to make a decision. But here's the other side of this equation that deserves real attention. Iran is not backing down either, at least not yet. And the question of why gets into some very deep and complicated territory. For the Iranian government, the nuclear program isn't just a military asset. It is a symbol of national sovereignty, technological achievement, and defiance in the face of Western pressure. For decades, Iran has watched the United States and its allies use economic and military leverage to try to shape Iranian behavior. Sanctions, embargoes, threats, targeted strikes. And through all of it, Iran has maintained its position. To the Iranian leadership, agreeing to give up the nuclear program under military pressure doesn't just mean giving up a weapon. It means admitting defeat. It means demonstrating to their own population, to the region, and to the world that pressure works, that if the United States pushes hard enough, Iran will fold. And that is something the current Iranian government has shown repeatedly it is deeply reluctant to do. So you have two sides, each with deeply entrenched positions, each believing they cannot afford to be the one who blinks first. The United States says you cannot have a nuclear weapon. That is the price of peace. Iran says take nuclear off the table, then we'll talk. And 2 months into an actual war, neither side has moved significantly, which is exactly why Trump's words Wednesday morning carry such a specific kind of urgency. They better get smart soon. That word, soon, is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It implies a timeline. It implies consequences. It implies that patience, even American patience backed by a $1.5 trillion defense budget, has a limit. Now, what happens next? That's the question everybody is watching. There are really a few possible paths forward from where we stand today. One path is a breakthrough. Iran agrees to engage on the nuclear question. Both sides find a framework for negotiations, and a roadmap toward a deal begins to take shape. This is the scenario the Trump administration says it wants. It's also the scenario that feels furthest away right now, given how entrenched both sides appear to be. A second path is continued stalemate. The war grinds on, the Strait of Hormuz remains a pressure point, oil markets remain volatile, and both sides continue their public posturing while waiting for the other to flinch. This is where we appear to be today. It's stable in a dangerous sort of way, but it is not sustainable indefinitely. A third path, and this is the one that makes the 4 a.m. Post and the no more Mr. Nice Guy imagery feel so significant, is escalation. If Iran continues to refuse negotiation on nuclear terms, what does the United States do next? What does escalation look like when you're already 2 months into an active military conflict? Nobody has answered that question publicly, not yet. But that question is absolutely being asked behind closed doors, in the Pentagon, in the State Department, and in Congress. And that is why this week matters so much. The Hegseth hearing, the budget proposal, the presidential messaging, all of it is part of a larger story about where this conflict goes from here, about whether diplomacy can find a foothold before the pressure to escalate becomes overwhelming. The Strait of Hormuz remains partially closed. Energy markets remain nervous. The region remains on edge, and a president who has now publicly said twice in 1 week that Iran needs to get smart, sign a deal, and do it soon. Marco Rubio said it clearly. Imagine a revolutionary government that already holds 20% of the world's energy supply hostage. Now give them a nuclear weapon. That is the scenario driving this entire conflict. That is the reason Operation Epic Fury exists. That is the reason the United States is 2 months into a war that the world is watching with increasing anxiety. The real question now is not whether a deal is possible. The real question is whether both sides can find a path to one before the cost of continued conflict, in lives, in economic damage, in regional stability, forces a different kind of ending entirely. And as Trump reminded everyone at 4 in the morning on Wednesday, the clock is ticking. What do you think? Is Iran going to come to the table on nuclear terms, or is this conflict headed somewhere much more serious? Drop your thoughts below, because this story is far from over.